Today we're diving into the War Within tanks. We're going to go through all 6 of them. We're going to go through the changes they had, their hero trees. We're going to talk about how they felt to play and what are my favorite tanks that I've tested so far. And at the very end of the video, I'm going to do a quick 1 to 6 ranking of how I feel like the tanks are right now and what place they sit in. So let's get into it. The first tank I want to talk about is the Prot Warrior. Now, I picked up Prot Warrior shortly before the beta opened and was really excited to try it out with the changes they made. Coming fresh from Dragonflight, I did feel a dip in the rage generation on the War Within. A few of the talents in the class tree no longer generate rage, and you end up taking other talents because of that. For example, Thunderous Roar no longer generates rage, and so we've kind of moved those talents into Champion Spear and Champion Might, and that initial pop of rage generation you got when going into a pack was something that I did notice. But that's probably the only negative I have for Warriors moving from Dragonflight to the War Within. In the War Within, they feel very tanky. Their mitigation's good, defensive stance doesn't reduce our damage output anymore and lets us sit in that stance without feeling like we're missing out on too much damage. We've also gained a talent that increased magic damage reduction from defensive stance by 5%, which has helped a lot in the War Within due to how many casters and how many different spells there are. Their self-healing is solid. Threat is a bit of an issue in beta right now, but Warriors still do a good job of gathering and holding mobs, and I've enjoyed their hero tree, so let's talk about it. They seemingly split the 2 trees, with one being a damage-centric, almost single target build, while the other one being an overall increase to your toolkit. So the first one we're going to talk about is Colossus. Colossus is built around the ability Demolish. Unleash a series of precise and powerful strikes against your target, dealing damage to it, and damage to enemies within 8 yards of it. Deals reduced damage beyond 8 targets. Now, Demolish has a 45-second cooldown, so every 45 seconds in between demolishes, you're using other abilities to build stacks of Colossal Might. Colossal Might makes your Demolish stronger. When you're using Revenge on more than 3 targets, Execute, or Shield Slam, you gain a stock of Colossal Might, increasing your next Demolish by 10%. Now, I want to make a note that Demolish is a channeled ability, and typically channeled abilities kind of leave you hanging in the wind, but in this case it reduces damage taken by 10% and allows you to block, dodge, parry, and cast shield block, so you're not getting beat up while you're casting it. The tree is a bit of a build and spend tree, but there is a lot of talents that just flat out increase damage abilities. It doesn't really affect your playstyle that much aside from hitting Demolish every 45 seconds, but that being said, Demolish is a fun ability to hit. The other tree is Mountain Thane. Mountain Thane feels like a much more balanced tree. While it doesn't have the big damage cooldown like Colossus, it offers better rage generation and more consistent benefits across all aspects of play, and more benefits from pull to pull. You get procs of Avatar throughout the dungeon. Your Thunderclap can turn into Thunder Blast, which deals Storm Strike damage and generates rage. Plus you have Lightning Bolt zapping your targets left and right, so you kind of feel like Thor when you charge a pack, Thunderclap, and 3 enemies get hit by lightning. So I think aesthetically, it's a cooler tree, and there's a bit more utility than Colossus as well. For example, you can have your Stormbolt stun 3 targets instead of 1 at the cost of a 10-second longer CD, which again, with how many casters are in the beta, it was a welcome trait. There's really good synergy between talents like Burst of Power, which gives your Lightning Strike a 15% chance to cause your next 2 Shield Slams to not have a CD, and talents like Heavy Repercussion, which causes your Shield Slam to generate 2 more rage and increase the shield block duration by 1 second. It felt much easier to maintain shield block throughout dungeons with those talents working together. Overall, Warrior feels pretty good regardless of the hero tree you pick. They both have niches they fit in well. I think Colossus is more of a raid build, while Mountain Thane feels much better in keys. Warrior overall feels a lot better than it did in Dragonflight, even with the rage generation being a little bit lower. You feel strong, you feel tanky, you got good self-healing, Spell Reflect gets a lot of value in dungeons, Spell Block gets a lot of value in dungeons, and it just feels overall like a very, very strong tank to play. All this is damage aside, I'm talking strictly gameplay. It feels nice to play. So for right now, I'm going to put Warrior in S tier. It was one of my favorite tanks playing throughout all these different tanks, and I didn't feel like I was constantly fighting to get ahead. I felt like once I charged the pack and stabilized, I felt strong and I felt safe. And I think that's a big part of the tanking aspect, is feeling good in the fight. So for now, I'm going to put Warrior in S tier. Alright, the next tank I want to cover is Prot Paladin. Prot Paladin was my favorite tank in Dragonflight. It had phenomenal healing with Word of Glory. They have so many defensives to rotate through if you need them, and true to Pally lore, you had the utility to help your party out in almost any scenario, whether it was sacking the healer during a big AoE damage phase, sniping a party member with Word of Glory, or bubbling a party member to keep them safe. Moving into the War Within, Pallies have taken a bit of a turn for the worst. With their self-healing feeling like it's at an all-time low, Word of Glory has almost no value to cast. Comparatively to other tanks, Prot Pally isn't even on the board for self-sustain, and that's due to their healing scaling with attack power rather than a percent-based healing. Currently, I think WoG maybe heals me for like 10% of my health, and with so much incoming damage in the beta, you really can't afford to waste a GCD, especially when you don't have any other self-healing kind of propping you up for that 1 or 2 seconds your Shield of Righteous might drop, because you casted Word of Glory. So casting Word of Glory just feels bad to do over pretty much any ability you need to maintain as a Pally. During testing, I was using a defensive CD for pretty much every pull in the dungeon, otherwise I'd get hit so hard on the pull that I would be in a dangerous spot that I couldn't really get myself out of without the healers needing to blast me with heals. But before I go on that tangent, let's dive into the hero talents. First, let's talk about Templar. Templar is a damage-focused build for Prot Paladins, primarily using Hammer of Light and Empyrean Hammers. The downside to this build is right off rip. You need Eye of Tyr, a talent deep in the spec tree, in order to use Hammer of Light, which I think is a design flaw. I know we typically take Eye of Tyr anyways, but that's not the point. Anytime a hero tree is linked to a talent deep in the spec tree, there's a limitation it puts on builds. Anyways, let's talk about Hammer of Light. When you use Eye of Tyr, it becomes Hammer of Light. It costs 5 holy power to cast, and it deals significant damage to its target and targets around it as well. When you use Eye of Tyr, you gain an absorb shield for 15% of your health, and then using Hammer of Light heals you for 15% of your health. So there's a little bit of a defensive aspect to this offensive ability. Outside of Hammer of Light, the talent tree is kind of built around generating stacks of Light's Deliverance, which at 60 stacks gives you a free Hammer of Light. But the synergy and buff duration around using Hammer of Light to increase the stacks of Light's Deliverance felt a bit clunky and short-lived. Sometimes there'd be really long gaps in between free Hammers of Light, which didn't feel great. So overall, the spec's main ability did feel good to hit when you could use it, and the healing it did and the Absorb Shield were nice, but outside of the tree, I didn't feel like I was doing much. The other tree we have is Lightsmith. Lightsmith is a support-oriented tree centered around Holy Armaments, which alternates between Holy Bulwark, a defensive shield, and Sacred Weapon, an ability that increases your damage and healing. Then you have Solidarity, which is a talent that allows you to share these benefits with allies. If you cast it on a specific party member, you get the buff as well. If you cast it on yourself, a random party member gets it too. It adds a bit of strategy to the build, which I actually liked in the aspect of being able to protect healers and being able to buff DPS in certain situations. Divine Inspiration is another talent which will randomly proc a Holy Armament on your ally, which in turn pops it on yourself as well, which is a good passive increase both offensively and defensively. So there are a couple good features in the tree. However, the rotational aspect of Holy Armaments makes it a little tricky to fully utilize. If you don't plan ahead, you can find yourself wanting the shield and having to just spend Sacred Weapon in a situation you don't necessarily want to, and then vice versa. Additionally, the CD of Holy Armaments is reduced when you consume your Shining Light buff, which is your free Word of Glory proc. But due to the current state of Word of Glory, it feels so bad to press, so you're either not pressing it or pressing it just for the CDR, as opposed to getting any real value out of it. And if you're hitting every free Word of Glory you get from procs to reduce the CD of Holy Armament, you blow through mana in just a couple of minutes. So I think they need to make Shining Light cause Word of Glory to not only be free of holy power, but free of mana as well. Additionally, if Word of Glory gets buffed and we use it more often because we're getting good value out of it, Lightsmith could become more fluid and effective. Because right now I feel like I'm hitting the button just for the CD, and in the beta when you're taking so much damage, you really can't afford to waste a GCD. Overall, I like the idea of the tree being that support tank that kind of fits the lore around Pallies. I liked having Bulwark as an extra defensive for me or a party member. It was nice to throw on healers in big damage phases and allow them to heal the party a bit more and worry about themselves a bit less. Typically always wanted Bulwark to be up because of how necessary defensive CDs feel for Pallies right now. And because of that, I didn't use Sacred Weapons as efficiently as I could. I would typically use it on myself just to get Bulwark ready to go. So hopefully with some changes, I won't need to rely so heavily on defensive abilities, and I can test out getting the full value from both sides of the ability. Overall, Prot Paladin needs some work. They need Shining Light to make Word of Glory not cost mana. Word of Glory needs a significant increase in healing to make it valuable and useful. Templar needs some adjustments to the way it generates Light's Deliverance stacks. And for Lightsmith, I'd like to see some other way to reduce the CD on Holy Armaments rather than casting Word of Glory. Because GCDs are very valuable right now in the beta, and I don't like the idea of adding a button to your rotation just to reduce the CD of another button. If Word of Glory wasn't on the global cooldown, it wouldn't be an issue, but I don't think that change happens. What I'd like to see is maybe reduce it from Consecrate cast. I don't think it's something we would spam, but it's something we need to hit anyways and might add some fluidity to the spec. Right now, I gotta put Pally in D tier, but with some changes, you could find... Right now, unfortunately, I gotta put Pally in D tier. With some number changes, it could find itself in the B or the A tier because defensively, it's still strong. I'm still able to do dungeons, but I have to focus so heavily on defensive CDs. And with a little bit of self-healing, a little bit of Word of Glory getting picked up, I won't need to rely on that so much. And with that, it kind of makes the whole class a little bit better. So with some number changes, it could be B, A. I don't know if it's quite S right now. I don't know if it provides the damage, but again, those are just numbers. I want to see Word of Glory get pumped up a little bit because it makes the rest of the spec feel better. All right, onto Bear Druids. Bear Druids was probably the most fun I had playing a tank, and I hadn't played them in a while. They feel really tanky, they have some solid defensives, but their self-healing can really pump in big pulls. I also like how their hero trees really split how you build a bear. No pun intended. Now, I don't know if that's a hot take or not, but I like how Elun's Chosen was heavily into Arcane Bear, while Druid of the Claw leaned more into bleeds and physical damage. Two very different ways to build your bear tank. Personally, it felt like their hero trees had the most impact on not necessarily how you play, but how you build them. The build I played the most was Arcane Bear with Elun's Chosen, so let's get into that. Elun's Chosen, like I said, is heavy into dealing arcane damage and healing you from that arcane damage. The thing I didn't like in the build is the same thing I didn't like in Templar. The whole build is around Lunar Beam, which is a capstone talent which does limit build diversity, and not something I think hero talent should be linked to. But back to Elun's Chosen. What I really liked about the build was the self-healing, and how the talents work together to increase that self-healing over time. The first talent makes your Lunar Beam cause you to leech life equal to 10% of all damage dealt to enemies in your beam. Then you have Elun's Favor, healing you for 40% of all arcane damage done. Then you have Thrash becoming arcane damage. Then you have Galactic Guardian consistently proccing, and paired with Twin Moonfire was easily dotting up packs with Moonfire. Then on top of that, each of those procs gives you a Moonfire that deals 300% more damage. So I noticed on big pulls, once I got a couple Moonfires out, Lunar Beam was rolling and I was thrashing, passively dotting and reapplying Moonfires with Galactic Guardian, there would be times that I would be at about 1 million heals per second. Sometimes I wouldn't even feel like I was taking that much damage. The downside is there's a little bit of a ramp window before everything's dotted and in your Lunar Beam, and you do have to be careful not to just get deleted in it. Another thing I noticed was threat is bad in the beta. But I had a harder time wrangling and holding threat on my bear than I did with any other tank I played. Once I had him grouped, it wasn't that bad, but I found myself chasing mobs that were going after hunters or mages or warriors a bit too frequently. Now, I played a couple different arcane builds, some with raise and some without, and I preferred the build without raise. Because we're so far to the right of the tree, I didn't make a way to get to Ursoc's Fury for a couple reasons. One, our attack power scaling is pretty poor, and the shield I was getting didn't feel as valuable as it does in Dragonflight, and needing to stretch talent points to the other side of the tree just didn't feel like it was worth it. So as full arcane, I was simply dumping my rage into Ironfur, and it felt fine. I don't know if that's going to be what we end up doing, but it felt really smooth and very easy to play, not having to balance spending rage on Raise or Ironfur. Another plus, and I guess minus for the build, is rage gen is very bursty. When you proc Galactic Guardian, you generate 10 rage because it hits 2 Moonfires that generate 5 rage each. And there would be windows where it would proc a bunch and I would just have almost unlimited rage. At other times, you would feel a bit starved. So it felt nice when you had a bunch of rage to blow through, but there were droughts with this tree. Overall, pretty fun hero tree. It's really nice to get rolling and to just be healing the hell out of yourself. I like the idea of Arcane Bear, although I wish they added more arcane style animations to the ability. Like Thrash should be very arcane. It should be a big purple slash through everything. Lunar Beam is just kind of like a cloud. They could make that a bit more intense. And just overall things like that make me feel like an Arcane Bear. It's also the tree I would recommend for people looking to play bear who haven't played before. It's very simple to use. Use your builders on CD, dot things with Moonfire, Lunar Beam on CD, and you can pretty much macro Iron Fur into your builders to make it easier. It might be bad practice and it might be bad to say, but that's what I did a couple runs in, and it felt fine. Now, the other hero tree is Druid of the Claw. To be honest, I didn't play it much, mainly because I didn't like the way it felt in dungeons. It felt like it could be okay as a raid build, but in dungeons it didn't provide the self-healing or tankiness that's needed. The tree revolves around increasing your physical and bleed damage and proccing Ravager, which felt just kind of like a juiced up raise. It does pretty solid damage, but it could use a better animation, as it doesn't really feel fun to press when it's up. One interesting part of the tree is how it encourages cat weaving. When you swap from bear to cat, you keep a large portion of your defensive stats that you had in bear, and it's honestly a really interesting, cool concept for a tank to encourage swapping to the DPS form, where in most scenarios you get one shot, but creating this window of 6 seconds for you to try and pump out as much damage as possible before going back to bear. It creates some interesting playstyles. For example, if you're completely out of rage and need to frenzied regen in an emergency situation, you could theoretically swap the cat, have 100 energy and frenzied regen, and then swap back to bear. Now, things like that make it cool, and I think you get most of those swap in and out benefits when you're in a raid. In dungeons, it didn't feel that good. Needing to keep Iron Fur up, but not being able to cast it in cat, not being able to taunt in cat, and things like that felt it a bit hindering in dungeons. It felt like you just couldn't get the full utility out of it. It's also super risky. If you were to get stunned or something where you can't get back into your bear form in time, you just die immediately. So it was a really risky playstyle, but I think it could be a little fine-tuned and have some changes and be really fun. Now, like I said, it wasn't really ideal for me in dungeons. If you found this great in dungeons, leave a comment below. I'm curious to see how you did. To wrap up bear, I'm gonna put it in B tier. It was fun to play and easy to play, but I do think there's some changes needed. Ursoc's Fury needs to be a little bit better. It's kind of the same reason Word of Glory is bad on Pallies. Our attack power scaling isn't great, so the damage you're dealing doesn't generate a strong enough shield for it to feel good to use. And along with the self-healing that Arcane has, in comparison, it's even worse. I'd like to see Raze also not be a capstone and rather in the first or second tier, because it seems kind of crazy that that is a capstone ability. One of our only AoE rage spenders is a capstone. Just doesn't feel right. I'd also like to see a little bit more threat generated from Thrash and maybe even Moonfire, because that was one of the bigger issues I dealt with in the Elun's Chosen spec. I'm hoping for some arcane style animations when you're in Elun's Chosen. I think Iron Fur when you're in Druid of the Claw should not only persist but be castable in Cat. Same with Taunt. So there's some changes that I think would make the class a little bit more efficient. But right now, if you wanted to go into a dungeon as a Elun's Chosen, as a full arcane bear, it feels really strong and it feels really fun to play. So I'm giving it B tier mainly because of Elun's Chosen. If Elun's Chosen wasn't viable, I don't think Druid of the Claw would feel really good in dungeons at all. So it would be a lot lower, but because of Elun's Chosen and because of how it feels, it might be a little tougher as you get higher in dungeons. But for right now in the testing we're doing, it felt like a B tier tank to me. So bear and B. Next tank I want to jump into is Brewmaster, and let me tell you, I was pleasantly surprised with Brew. Like, shocked actually. I think I played it on stream, but I didn't have my camera on, but my jaw dropped when I did my first pull, and I just didn't get destroyed the way I was getting destroyed with a lot of other tanks. Brew has a reputation for being squishy and bloated with too many buttons, and let me tell you, that couldn't be further from how they feel now. They've lost several abilities, and it does affect your damage a bit, but the class as a whole feels much better to play. I played Brew probably last in all my tanks, and I was blown away with how tanky they were. With so much yo-yoing in health that we see in the current beta, Monk's Stagger really helps flatten that to a point where the incoming damage feels much more stable and much more manageable. Combining that with the lower amount of buttons you need to press and your ability to focus a little more on properly using Purifying Brew and Celestial Brew felt very good to play. I was never a fan of Monk and Dragonflight, but if things don't change, I very well might be maining them in the War Within. Now the Monk's hero trees are Shadowpan and Master of Harmony. Master of Harmony I liked a lot, Shadowpan not so much. Let's get into Master of Harmony first. Master of Harmony is mostly based around generating vitality from damage and healing, and then when you cast Celestial Brew, you begin to expel that vitality and deal 25% increased damage for 10 seconds. After the 10 seconds, any vitality that's remaining is expelled as damage among enemies. Now, thanks to your capstone, when you're expelling vitality, any direct attacks have a chance to intensify the damage you're doing, and also spread to other targets. What I like about this is you essentially can use AoE to generate a large amount of vitality and funnel that into a priority target. Then, as you attack that target, it gets stronger and has a chance to jump to other targets. So you're AoEing into a funnel that begins to spread. I really like how it works and allows you to make up for some of that single target damage that you lost with the abilities you don't have anymore. You also gain an extra charge of Celestial Brew in the spec, which is great both offensively and defensively. One of the other great talents in the tree is Manifestation, which increases your Chi Burst damage and healing by 100%. Currently it's like a million damage ability on a 45-second CD that you can angle to hit multiple targets. It's a really great way to establish threat or pull from a distance. Overall, I just loved how the tree worked with the spec. It felt passive enough that you don't need to change your style, but it also gave you some interactions with Celestial Brew and Chi Burst that you can use on demand, so it had a good balance. The second hero tree is Shadowpan, focusing around Flurry Strikes, the first talent in the tree. Every 350k-ish damage you deal, you generate a flurry charge. Every time you spend 400 energy, you unleash all those charges, dealing damage per charge. So basically, you're passively generating flurry charges, and simply by going through your rotation and spending energy, when you hit 400 energy spent, you cast Flurry Strikes and you do a big burst of damage. Now, there's a couple issues I had with the synergy, and it's mainly that Flurry Strikes generates almost immediately. Spending 400 energy takes almost a minute. And that's if you're solely using spenders. So you sit at max Flurry Strikes for kind of a long time. Because it's all passive, you wouldn't really pay attention to it, but the first time I was testing, I was surprised how long it took between generating 10 stacks and using them with Flurry Strike. At first I thought maybe there were some talents that made Flurry Strike stronger, and you needed time to build those up, but the only one that does any kind of increase is Vigilant Watch, and all you need to do is Blackout Kick to get it. Another problem I noticed is with the capstone talent, Wisdom of the Wall. Every 10 Flurry Strikes become infused with one of the following for 20 seconds. Crit damage increased by 30%, that's good. Dodge and crit chance increased by 25% of your verse, that's good. Effects of your mastery increased by 25%, that's okay. And the last one, which felt like a total dud, was Flurry Strikes deal shadow damage to all your uncontrolled enemies within 6 yards. The effect lasts 20 seconds. It happens right after you Flurry Strike, which means you need to spend 400 energy in 20 seconds to get any benefit out of the last effect, which I don't think is possible. Now maybe I'm misunderstanding this, because to me it says, in this 20-second window, Flurry Strikes deal shadow damage to all uncontrolled enemies within 6 yards, but you need to spend 400 energy in order to cast Flurry Strikes, and they don't overlap right. So if I'm misreading that, let me know in the comments, please, because that was one of the things that I was really confused on. Now, it could just be a bug, could be a misread in the tooltip, it could just be your next Flurry Strike and not one in that window, but when I first was playing around with it, I was thinking, how can you possibly get benefit out of this effect? Now, another talent that feels a bit weird is Flurry Strikes increase your agility by 1% for 6 seconds, stacking 20 times. Now in testing, it was 1% of agility per Flurry Strike expelled, but you can only stack to 10 Flurry Strikes, so you can never really hit that 20 stacks. There seems to just be a couple talents in the tree that don't seem to be working properly. I don't know if it's a tooltip bug and it's supposed to say 10 stacks or what, but because it feels like you can't get the full benefit out of some abilities, it doesn't feel that great to play. Now, I did this in a handful of dungeons, and if there's something that's in my face that I'm missing, please let me know in the comments below. So overall, Shadowpan, I think there needs to be some adjustments to the tree. It doesn't feel as cohesive and effective as Master of Harmony feels right now. Other than the bugs in the Shadowpan tree, if they are bugs and it's not just me missing something, Monk felt incredible to play. I'm actually going to put it in S tier for now. There are always some changes that can come, but who knows if this is how it is when it goes live. But for beta, it's probably the best tank I've played as far as gameplay, tankiness, synergy with Master of Harmony, and it just feels really good to play. You hold threat well, you self-heal well, you have ways to get you out of situations, you're mobile, like everything felt good about playing Monk. So S tier for Monk right now. Alright, let's talk Blood Death Knight. When playing a Blood Death Knight right, it feels incredibly satisfying. You're like an unstoppable force. You take a ton of damage and then you heal yourself right back up for a lot of that damage. And you have these powerful abilities. Blood DKs have always been kings of self-sustain. There were times when I was testing where my party would die on a pull, and I would just keep trucking along, healing myself, dealing good damage, they would run back, and we'd finish the pull. Times when bosses would wipe the group, and I would actually ask, do you want me to finish, or do you want me to reset? Knowing that I could get through the boss by myself, but it would just take a little bit. Now, Blood DKs are all about managing resources and cooldowns to stay alive while dealing damage, and let me tell you, they deal probably the most damage among tanks, both single and AoE. They just pump out damage. So if you like feeling self-sufficient with a lot of personal responsibility, but a good payoff, Blood DK is a solid pick. First off, let's dive into the Sand Lane tree. This setup is all about Vampiric Blood and the key move, Vampiric Strike, which replaces Heart Strike and is mostly used during Vampiric Blood. There is some procs that get it outside of that, but mostly you're focusing on Vampiric Blood. Every time you hit Vampiric Strike, you get a stack of Essence of the Blood Queen, giving you a hefty haste boost. The idea is to hit Vampiric Strike as much as possible when Vampiric Blood is up, because it heals you a bunch, it can refund the runes you used, and the Infliction of Sorrow talent adds a ton of bonus damage to your Blood Plague. The gameplay loop for Sand Lane is all about timing. Before you pop Vampiric Blood, you need to prep. Refresh Bone Shield, hit Death Strike for Coagulopathy, and get Blood Plague rolling with Blood Boil. Once you're in Vampiric Blood, it's all about spamming Vampiric Strikes and keeping Coagulopathy up. You get massive self-heals and deal out crazy damage. The downside of the tree, not much utility for your party except for a little leech from Vampiric Aura, but the self-sustain and the burst make up for it. I genuinely enjoyed this tree. I felt like there was some prep time to get into a proper Vampiric Blood, but I also felt like there were some times I was in a rough spot, could hit consumption for extra runes, pop Vampiric Blood, and start blasting Vampiric Strike for healing while runic power was generating, and then rotate into Death Strike for more healing and Blood Shield when I was out of runes. So it allowed me to generate healing from both sides of my resources, which felt really good in tight situations. Now, on the other side of the trees is Deathbringer. This tree is all about balance, focusing not just on Reaper's Mark, but using your entire toolkit to amp it up. Reaper's Mark deals damage and applies a Reaper's Mark debuff to your target. Each time you deal shadow or frost damage, you add a stack to the mark. After 12 seconds, or when you reach 40 stacks, the mark explodes. 40 stacks seem like a lot, but Blood Plague and Blood Boil help it stack up quickly. There are talents in the tree that cause Shadow Frost damage to apply 2 marks and 4 marks when it crits, and it also turns Blood Boil into Shadow Frost damage. There's also a choice node to cause your Blood Plague to deal damage 100% quicker. On top of that, your Blood Plague gets a chance to deal 30% increased damage as Shadow Frost, so it again adds to building those stacks up quicker. It does feel tight sometimes if you don't get a couple crits in the mix, but having 2 charges of Blood Boil when you pop it does make it stack a lot easier. There wasn't many times I didn't reach 40 stacks, but there were definitely some close calls. Reaper's Mark deals really good damage and does so on a couple of different occasions. When you cast it, it deals good damage not only to the target, but thanks to the Wave of Souls talent, it also hits all nearby targets with Shadow Frost damage. Then, of course, when it expires, it deals big damage to the target, again expanded to nearby enemies through Soul Rupture. And lastly, when you cast Empowered Marrow Rend after Reaper's Mark, it strikes with a scythe on your main target, and then the second cast strikes nearby enemies. So it's got a lot of damage in both single target and AoE throughout different phases of its cast. Now that's the main gist of Deathbringer. You can talent into having Reaper's Mark every 30 seconds, which I enjoyed. I liked having it on almost every pull, if not every pull in a dungeon. I liked the increased speed for Blood Plague. It felt like if an enemy died quick, you still got some value out of it. It doesn't affect your playstyle too much, aside from maybe holding a Blood Boil charge for the mark, but even then it didn't feel too bad. It's a great tree. You use all your abilities consistently, and there's no red button like in Sand Lane where you're just spamming one ability for 6 or 7 seconds trying to funnel into a burst window. It's a bit more spread out. Plus the tree has great utility. Cooldown reduction on Lichborn, Rune Carved Plates has incredible uptime because it's based on spending and generating runes, so you're consistently adding to the buff without really doing anything. The animations are cool, Blood Boil becomes swapped to like a frost-like mist, and overall I just really like the tree. Also with Blood Plague ticking twice as fast, you get that healing from it a little bit more consistently and a little quicker, which was a really nice addition. Overall, I like the tree. There are some bugs. I don't want to get into the bugs right now because hopefully they're getting taken care of and fixed, and it's not worth learning how to play with the bugs. But they don't inhibit the playstyle at all, and like I said, will likely be fixed. To wrap up Blood DKs, they offer 2 unique playstyles. Sand Lane is very maximizing self-healing. There's burst windows. You're focusing on doing as much as you can in Vampiric Blood with a little bit of prep work. Deathbringer focuses a little bit more on a balanced play. You are hitting Reaper's Mark on cooldown, but you're also utilizing the rest of your abilities to build that up. So it's kind of spread out among your abilities. It's kind of like how Warrior is with Colossus to Mountain Thane. You know, Mountain Thane's a good overall from pull to pull, and that's kind of how Deathbringer felt as well. Both builds require good management of your abilities and your resources, making Blood DKs a little tough, but they're very fun to play. Whether you want to be a self-sustaining powerhouse with Sand Lane, or you want to be a kind of overall balanced damage dealer with great utility and Deathbringer, Blood DK is a solid choice. However, I do want to put a little caveat. If you are new to tanking, Blood DK can be pretty tough to dive into. The need to be very aware of your resources at all times can prove to be a little difficult to play. It's probably not what I would recommend to new players or new tank players, because it very easily find yourself without runes or runic power and unable to get yourself out of tight situations. If you're a bit more familiar with tanking or DKs in general, I think it's a very solid pick going into the War Within. I think they're going to thrive in raid content and still be pretty good in Mythic Plus. They deal a ton of AoE damage, but they suffer from the fatal flaw of DKs, and that is one-shot potential. Your whole self-sustain revolves around taking damage in order to heal a percent of the damage you take, and in high-key scenarios, they've always had the issue where mobs can sync up and 100 to 0 your tank, and you can't heal if you're dead. So we'll see if they do anything to change that or to deal with that in the future. But since this video has been mostly about Mythic Plus, I'm going to put them in B tier, low B, high C. I'm going to put them in B tier. No, let's go B tier. I think that for raids, they're probably an S tier tank, but for Mythic Plus, I feel like they're B, just because of that limiting one-shot potential that always is looming. But otherwise, they have really good utility, really good damage, really good healing. I think if they can find a way to improve our on-pull damage, that potential to get one shot, then they can easily jump up a rank or two. So for right now, I'm going to say B for Mythic Plus, S tier for raids. I know I haven't really been throwing raids in, but I think it's notable when they're that good at raids to throw that in. Now we got our last tank, Vengence Demon Hunter. Not the tank I've played a lot, so if I'm missing something, please let me know. So this is kind of like somebody who hasn't played it and is going into it. So this is a new perspective. First off, Vengence DH has got a couple of tweaks. Fiery Demise now gives you a 20 to 40% fire damage boost instead of a 25 to 50%. It's a minor damage drop, nothing too crazy. The bigger change is to Illuminated Sigils, which now instead of giving you 2 of each sigil, it gives you a second charge of Sigil of Flame and reduces its cooldown by 5 seconds. This was a noticeable nerf in crowd control, especially in Mythic Plus, where managing enemies is so important. But despite this, Vengeance Demon Hunter still excels at crowd control. It still has more stops than any other tank and more control. So they're still strong in the control aspect, just not as insanely dominant as before. Our VDH hero trees do a good job of making the class feel a little better too, so let's jump into them. The Eldrachi Reaver talent tree is all about harnessing power your glaive. It centers around the art of the glaive, which transforms your throw glaive into Reaver's glaive. This effect empowers shear or fracture and soul cleave, making them hit harder along with some additional effects. The catch to the ability is you need to consume 30 soul fragments or cast the hunt to activate Art of the Glaive. So it's not something you can spam constantly. But with the recent change of 40 souls needed to be consumed down to 30 souls needed, you can line it up better with 45-second cooldowns, and it does make it feel a little smoother. The tree has some big damage talents. Reaver's Mark applies a 15% damage taken debuff to your target if you attack with an enhanced shear. If you cast it after Soul Cleave, then Reaver's Mark is increased to 30% damage taken. So there's a bit of nuance on how you apply the debuff. Plus you have Incisive Blade, which is a flat 30% damage increase to Soul Cleave, which makes Soul Cleave a pretty strong spender, and it kind of creates a debate on when to use Spirit Bomb and Soul Cleave and makes them a little bit more competitive with each other. Thrill of the Fight is the capstone talent, and it stacks another damage boost with Reaver's Mark, giving you some serious burst potential. Eldrachi Reaver feels like a strong single target tree, focusing on burst damage windows And with some recent updates, it does do really well in AoE, but that's strictly from a damage perspective. Defensively, it's not groundbreaking. It does offer some passive soul generation for better healing, but outside of army unto oneself causing your Fellblade to give you a 10% DR for 5 seconds, there wasn't much defensively to the tree. So this is another tree that I can see being really solid in raids, but to me, the other one felt better in Mythic Plus. So let's talk about Fellscar. Fellscar is the other tree, and this one's all about metamorphosis, and utilizing things like the demonic talent, which gives you metamorphosis whenever you cast Fell Devastation. In demon form, you get a big ability boost. Spirit Bomb, Soul Cleave, and Fell Devastation, Sigil of Flame, and Immolation Aura all hit harder and trigger Demon Surge, causing an explosion that deals AoE damage. Fellscarred gameplay is pretty relaxed outside of the metamorphosis window. Your playstyle doesn't change very much, but in those metamorphosis windows, you'll want to maximize your empowered abilities for big damage. There's also a bit of a learning curve to Burning Blades, which buffs Soul Cleave. You'll need to figure out when to use Soul Cleave over Spirit Bomb, and especially with the new tier set. Now, as I mentioned, I'm a bit of a novice in VDH, so the logistics of something like that, I gotta leave to the guys in Fellhammer or some better DHs to figure out. But it feels like there'll be some parameters to follow on how and when to use each ability. Offensively, Fellscar felt good in multiple targets. Demon Surge is uncapped. Violent Transformation resets your cooldown of Sigil of Flame and Fell Devastation, which helps with more metamorphosis uptime. And defensively, it's got a few strong nodes. Set Fire to the Pain creates a stagger effect similar to Monks, where 5% of all non-fire damage taken is instead taken as fire damage and over 6 seconds. On top of that, all fire damage is reduced by 10%. This is a surprisingly strong ability, converting 5% of all your damage taken to fire damage, reducing it by 10%, and then stretching it over 6 seconds, all work together to add a nice level of tankiness to VDH. Also, you have Enduring Torment and Monster Rising, which aren't the best defensively, but it does provide a passive defensive layer that's always active when you're not in Metamorphosis, which is when you're the weakest. So, not great, but happy to have. Overall, Vengeance Demon Hunter offers kind of two different playstyles. Eldrazi Reaver tends to be a little bit more focused on burst damage and single target strength, while Fellscarred shines in AoE and offers typical Mythic Plus defensive options. Both trees add a little bit of different playstyles and a little bit of nuance to the Vengeance Demon Hunter, making it feel a little better coming out of Dragonflight and making up for the things that they lost. I know Eliminated Sigils probably hurt the most, but they still have the control. It's okay. So overall, I'm going to put it in probably high C, low B. And maybe that's a little bias. As I said, BDH is probably my least played tank, so I might not be getting the full value out of it. And someone who has played BDH might really like the playstyle. But to me, as somebody who is new coming into playing it, that's kind of how I got the feel for it. I think that VDH is one of those tanks that's a little weird to just pick up and play. Most of the other tanks have a similar, this is what you do, this is your maintenance, and this is that and the other thing, where VDH kind of breaks that mold a little bit, where you're not doing the same kind of things that other tanks are. So it's a little bit more to take in, and I think that also plays a role in my rating for it, because it's a little tougher for people to pick up and play. But overall, I think they're cool. I think Fellscarred's going to shine in Mythic Plus, and Eldrazi is going to be the raid one, but definitely going to play it a little bit more, because they did feel like they had the potential to be really strong. They just didn't seem to outshine anything in the A tier or in the S tier. So that's why they ended up in B or high C. And that's it, guys. That is all 6 tanks, kind of how it felt to play them, going over some of the hero trees. Let me know which tank you like the most. So far, if I'm going to give a quick rating at the end of the video, I'm putting Monk, Warrior, Blood DK, Druid, Vengeance Demon Hunter, Paladin. That's my top 6. And I'm most likely going to be playing Monk going into this War Within, so I'm going to be streaming some Monk in the next couple days, so make sure to tune in if you haven't already. As always, till next time, guys.